Speaker.
I call Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on the Government's Gambling Amendment Bill number 3, and it's very pleasing, sir, to see that it is receiving wide support from around the House. I think this has some provisions in it that are worthy of consideration by the Select Committee, and I should think, given this is an issue that most members support improving the transparency and improving the regulation of gambling, it'll be something that has very constructive consideration at the Select Committee. I was somewhat disappointed, sir, with the contribution by the New Zealand First member, Clayton Mitchell. I thought it was, I thought it was full of droppings, to be honest with you. I was very, very disappointed because he was bordering on misleading the House when he said that we don't know about what the impact of gambling is and who is affected by problem gambling. And I appreciate what the member says. I appreciate what the member says, that the vast majority of people who gamble do so in a safe way, just as the vast majority of people who drink do so in a safe way. Yet we have a very, very tight regulatory system around alcohol, and during the last term of Parliament, there was a lot of the time of Parliament was spent passing new legislation to regulate alcohol, despite the fact that the vast majority of people can use alcohol quite safely. But we do need to legislate for the fact that it does have a harmful impact. And we know that gambling has a harmful impact on our communities. Every day, New Zealanders lose $5.5 million on gambling. $5.5 million every single day. That is not insignificant. It's about $2 billion a year, and half of that, and I think Kevin Haig pointed this out, half of that $2 billion a year goes on the pokie machines. And the pokie machines are probably the most insidious and nasty and most addictive form of gambling that there is out there. And of course the pokie machines are one of the primary forms of gambling that occur outside of casinos, a little bit more hidden away, in darkened rooms, usually out the back of the pub, where people just quietly spend hours and hours and hours spending their paycheck. Sorry? It's personal freedom, says Dennis O'Rourke. Just as it's personal freedom to go down to the pub and spend some money drinking alcohol. Yet I know that that party voted in favour of legislation that was designed to reduce the harm caused by alcohol, because families lose an awful lot of money to alcohol addiction. Just as families, the most vulnerable families that member should be standing up for, the most vulnerable families that member should be standing up for, their lives are ruined by problem gambling. This is the member for problem gambling. This is the member who wants to see vulnerable families harmed, to see children not have food put on the table, to see people miss their mortgage payments, to see people indebted to finance companies because they've lost their money on gambling. That member should be ashamed. That member should be absolutely ashamed for standing up for the gambling industry and for not being prepared to stand up for vulnerable families, sir. Sir, the New Zealand Health Survey, well, if the Minister Jonathan Coleman doesn't think that MPs should get passionate about the most vulnerable people in our society, I know what that member gets passionate about. He gets passionate about tax cuts for the rich. He gets passionate about ensuring that there's plenty of loopholes. He gets passionate about corporate boxes and smoking cigars. He gets passionate about a lot of things, but he obviously doesn't get passionate about the most vulnerable. So if he thinks I've lost it, because one of the things that annoys me the most is when members of Parliament are prepared to defend industries that prey on the most vulnerable people in society, then I think that tells you a lot more about Jonathan Coleman's values than it does about mine, sir. Sir, that New Zealand Health Survey reported that 3% of adults, about 87,000 people, experienced problems due to someone's gambling in the previous 12 months. So a lot of the harm caused by gambling isn't just to the person themselves, isn't just to the gambler, it's to their wider families and their wider society and community. 2 out of 5 regular pokie players is likely to have a gambling problem. So, and I hear the members in New Zealand First saying, what about the sports clubs? What about the community and voluntary organisations? Well, you know, and like Chris Hipkins, I have been involved with organisations that have relied on donations and funding from organisations that raise their funds through pokie money. But of course, the only reason that we're reliant on the funds from gambling to support community and voluntary organisations is because we are not prepared to fund them in some other form. That's the only reason. So I don't have any truck with people who say, what's the impact going to be on voluntary and community organisations? If members of this House are so concerned about ensuring that those organisations that do good work in our community and support youngsters to get involved in sport and all the myriad things that these organisations that rely on the funds from pokies do, then we should establish a fund to make sure that those organisations can be funded without the need for gambling monies. Because what it is essentially is it's a tax on the poor and the vulnerable. It is a tax on the poor and the vulnerable in order to fund organisations that should be able to rely on more reliable and more seamless forms of funding than a tax on the poor and the vulnerable, which is essentially what gambling is. So I'm no prohibitionist. I am no prohibitionist, and members around here will know that. But we do need to make sure that we have a transparent and conflict of interest-free regulatory system to ensure that those proceeds that are collected from gambling are appropriately deployed, sir. And I have to say, I got a lot of those statistics that I used to demonstrate just how harmful gambling is in this country. I got those from the Health Promotion Agency website because the Health Promotion Agency is, of course, the government-mandated organisation to deal with and try to reduce the effects of harmful gambling, just as they are involved with trying to reduce the harmful effects with other addictive activities and other health issues. And so I have to say the information is very useful and they do a very good job. But if we're going to deal with reducing conflicts of interest in the regulation of gambling, then I think the Health Promotion Agency needs to get its own house in order by dealing with the conflict of interest that Catherine Rich has when she is on an organisation, she's on the board of an organisation that is supposed to reduce the harm caused by alcohol and that is supposed to reduce the harm caused by diabetes and obesity and heart disease, and yet with her other hat on, and we know about the difficulty that the Prime Minister has with his multiple hats and the conflict of interest they can create for him. Catherine Rich, with her other hat on, comes along to select committees, goes along and lobbies ministers, talks to bloggers about, sir, well, you know, sir, this is an important component of this. Gambling. This bill is about reducing conflicts of interest. And the organisation that is mandated with reducing the harm associated with gambling, which is what this legislation is all about, is the Health Promotion Agency, which has to deal with an enormous conflict of interest in their own house, which is the situation where Catherine Rich, who lobbies for the alcohol industry, who lobbies for the sugar industry, who lobbies for so many businesses that cause harm, and yet she is there on the Health Promotion Agency supposedly doing the exact opposite. Meanwhile, funding who knows who to attack anybody who speaks out against the alcohol industry or speaks out in favour of greater regulation of food that causes harm. Sir, gambling is something that people can enjoy. I put some money on the Melbourne Cup the other day. It was the first time I've placed a bet in quite some time. Sir, I put some money. Well, it was red. I went for the box trifecta, and I had Red Cadeau and I had Protectionist. Silly me, I didn't back the New Zealand horse otherwise. And I don't want to dwell on how that impacted me financially. But anyway, $10 spent for a bit of fun, and that's probably my gambling for the year. But that is not the story for so many people. That is not the story for so many people. For so many people, the day the paycheck arrives, they are in the pokies spending money that should be spent on their rent, that should be spent on their mortgage, that should be spent on food, that should be spent on their children. Because gambling can be addictive for a significant proportion of the population. Therefore, we need to have good regulation. We do need to have good regulation. And so that is why Labor supports this bill. And that's why Labor MPs like me get passionate about issues which affect the most vulnerable in society.